My brother demanded I fund his photography dreams for 3 years, then humiliated me at my MBA graduation party in front of my boss and colleagues, so I kicked him out and discovered he was running dating app scams worth $80,000. My 28 male brother Brock, 25 male, has been living off my money for 3 years, and I finally cut him off after what he did at my MBA graduation party. I work as a project manager for a construction company. It's not glamorous work, but I make decent money and I've always been careful with finances. I paid off my student loans early, bought a reliable used Honda Civic, and saved up for a small condo. My parents always praised me for being responsible while Brock was the creative one who needed support to find his path. Brock dropped out of college twice. First from film school after one semester because he said the professors didn't understand his vision. Then from community college where he was studying graphic design because he claimed the coursework was beneath him. Both times, our parents Rebecca, 52 female, and Jim, 55 male, convinced me to help out because Brock just needed time to figure things out. Our dad works at a hardware store and our mom cleans office buildings at night. They don't make much money, so when Brock needed help, they always came to me. I felt guilty saying no because I was doing well financially while they struggled. 3 years ago, Brock moved in with me rent-free after his second college dropout. He said he needed 6 months to get on his feet while he worked on his photography business. He had bought expensive camera equipment with money from his college fund and was convinced he could make it as a wedding photographer. The 6 months turned into 3 years. Brock would book maybe 2 or 3 small photography gigs per year, usually friend of a friend situations that paid a few $100s. He spent most of his time editing photos that no one had hired him to take or working on what he called his artistic portfolio. Meanwhile, I was paying for everything. Groceries, utilities, internet, his car insurance, his phone bill, and his health insurance since he was still on my plan from when he lived at home. Brock would occasionally offer to pay me back when his business took off, but mostly he acted like I owed him this support because I had been luckier in life. The breaking point should have come earlier, but I kept making excuses for him. When he bought a $1,200 drone for his photography business using my credit card without asking, I was upset but didn't kick him out. When he invited friends over for loud parties on work nights, I just slept with earplugs. When he ate all the groceries I bought and then complained there was nothing good in the fridge, I went shopping more often. Last year, I decided to go back to school for my MBA. I had been accepted to a good program that met on weekends and evenings, so I could keep working full-time. It meant 2 years of no free time and a lot of stress, but I wanted to advance my career and eventually start my own construction consulting business. Brock made fun of the MBA program constantly. He said I was wasting money on a useless degree and that business school was for people with no real talents. He claimed my construction work was contributing to environmental destruction and that his art was more meaningful than anything I would ever do. I ignored his comments and focused on my studies. The program was intense, but I maintained a 3.8 GPA while working 50-hour weeks. I had to take out some student loans, but I knew the investment would pay off. My girlfriend Sarah, 26 female, who I had been dating for 8 months, was incredibly supportive during this time. 2 months ago, I finished my MBA program. My parents were proud and wanted to throw me a graduation party. Sarah offered to help plan it, and we decided to have it at my condo since it has a nice backyard. We kept it simple but nice, catered food from a local restaurant, a small bar setup, and decorations from the party store. We invited about 30 people including family, friends from work, some classmates, and a few neighbors. Sarah made a photo display showing pictures from throughout the 2 years of school. My parents bought me a nice watch as a graduation gift. Everything was set up perfectly for a Saturday afternoon celebration. The party was going well. People were enjoying the food, sharing stories about school and work, and congratulating me on finishing the program. My boss was there and mentioned he was considering me for a promotion that would come with a significant salary increase. Several classmates talked about potentially partnering with me on the consulting business idea. Then Brock showed up drunk. He had been at a bar since noon, which I found out later when other people told me they had seen him there. He stumbled into the backyard wearing ripped jeans and a stained t-shirt while everyone else was dressed nicely for the occasion. At first, he just stood in the corner drinking beer and making loud comments about how boring everyone looked. I asked Sarah to keep an eye on him while I talked to my boss and some potential business partners. I thought maybe he would sober up and behave himself if I ignored his attention-seeking behavior. But Brock had other plans. He grabbed the microphone I had rented for announcements and started giving his own speech about how college was a scam and how I had wasted 2 years of my life. He said real artists like him didn't need degrees to validate their worth and that everyone at the party was just pretending to care about my achievement. People started looking uncomfortable. My boss stepped away from our conversation to take a phone call. Sarah walked over to try to get Brock to put the microphone down, but he pushed her away and told her to mind her own business. Then Brock announced that he had something special to show everyone. He pulled out his phone and started playing a slideshow on the TV that was connected for background music. But instead of photos related to graduation, he had put together a compilation of embarrassing pictures of me from childhood and college, including some photos from a party where I had clearly had too much to drink. The final slide was a photo he had taken of my bank statements without my knowledge. He had highlighted all the payments I had made for his expenses over the past 3 years and written calculations showing the total amount. Then he announced to everyone that I had spent over $47,000 supporting his artistic career and that this MBA was just me trying to make enough money to keep funding his dreams. The room went completely silent. My boss made an excuse and left early. Several classmates found reasons to leave soon after. My parents stood there looking mortified but didn't say anything to Brock. Sarah went inside and started cleaning up, which I could tell meant she was trying not to cry in front of everyone. I walked over to Brock and told him the party was over and that he needed to leave immediately. He laughed and said he was just being honest about our relationship and that everyone deserved to know the truth about where my money really went. He claimed I should be thanking him for helping me become more generous and less selfish than I used to be. The party ended about an hour early. After everyone left, I sat in my backyard looking at the decorations and leftover food while Sarah finished cleaning up inside. She didn't say much, but I could tell she was embarrassed about what had happened in front of people she was meeting for the first time. That night, I made a decision. I waited until Brock went to sleep, then I gathered all his photography equipment, packed his clothes into garbage bags, and loaded everything into his car. I left a note saying he had 48 hours to find somewhere else to live and that I would no longer be paying for any of his expenses. When he woke up the next morning and found his stuff packed, he started yelling about how I was destroying his life and ruining his business. He said the graduation party was just a joke and that I was being too sensitive about everything. He claimed I owed him continued support because he had sacrificed his own opportunities to be my roommate and help me through school. I told him I was done. I canceled his phone line that day, removed him from my car insurance, and called my health insurance company to take him off my plan. I changed the locks on my condo and blocked his number. My parents called me that evening asking what had happened. Brock had shown up at their house claiming I had kicked him out for no reason. When I explained what he did at the graduation party, my mom said that Brock was just trying to be funny and that family should stick together through difficult times. My dad said Brock was going through a rough patch and needed support, not abandonment. I told them they were welcome to support Brock themselves, but that I was finished being his bank account. My mom started crying and said I was being cruel to someone who had always looked up to me. My dad said I was letting success go to my head and forgetting about family loyalty. It's been 2 weeks since I kicked Brock out. He has been staying with my parents, who are struggling to support him on their limited income. He has been calling me from different phone numbers asking for one more chance and promising to pay me back. My parents call every few days asking me to reconsider because Brock is depressed and not taking care of himself. Sarah has been supportive of my decision, but some of my extended family members think I went too far. My aunt texted me saying that Brock is family and that successful people have a responsibility to help their relatives who are less fortunate. I keep wondering if I should have handled this differently or if I'm being too harsh. But every time I think about the graduation party and how Brock deliberately tried to humiliate me in front of my colleagues and friends, I remember why I made this decision. Am I being unreasonable for cutting off financial support to my brother after what he did at my graduation party? Update 1. Thank you to everyone who responded to my original post. The support really helped me stick to my decision during some difficult weeks. I have an update that I honestly didn't see coming. After my original post, things got worse before they got better. Brock continued calling me from different numbers, sometimes drunk and sometimes crying. He left long voicemails talking about how I had abandoned him in his time of need and how he was going to end up homeless because of my selfishness. My parents were calling me daily, each conversation lasting over an hour as they tried different approaches to convince me to take Brock back. My mom would cry and talk about how we used to be such close brothers. My dad would lecture me about family responsibility and Christian values. They even suggested that Sarah was influencing me to be cold toward my own family. I stayed firm in my decision, but it was exhausting. I started letting their calls go to voicemail and only responded with text messages saying my position hadn't changed. Sarah was getting frustrated because our conversations kept getting interrupted by family drama, and I could tell the stress was affecting our relationship. 3 days ago, something happened that changed everything. My mom called me at work, which was unusual because she knew I didn't like personal calls during business hours. She was speaking in a weird, quiet voice and said she needed to talk to me about Brock but not over the phone. I drove to their house after work, expecting another intervention attempt. Instead, my mom met me at the door looking exhausted and defeated. She said they needed to show me something they had found in Brock's room. We went upstairs to his childhood bedroom where Brock had been staying. On his desk was an open laptop with multiple browser tabs and printed emails scattered around. My dad explained that Brock had left everything open when he went out that morning, and my mom had seen some concerning information while cleaning his room. What they discovered was that Brock had been running a small scam operation for the past year. He had been using photos from my social media accounts and information about my job to create fake dating profiles on multiple apps. In these profiles, he presented himself as a successful construction project manager looking for love. He had been matching with women and building relationships through text and phone calls, but never meeting them in person. After gaining their trust, he would create sob stories about needing money for various emergencies, car repairs, medical bills, helping a sick relative. The amounts were usually between $200 and $800, small enough that the women felt comfortable helping someone they thought they were falling in love with. The printed emails showed conversations with at least 12 different women over the past year. He had received money from most of them, with some women sending multiple payments over several months. The total amount appeared to be somewhere around $8,000, though it was hard to calculate exactly because some conversations were missing. My parents had also found a separate bank account statement that Brock had been hiding. He had been depositing these payments into an account they didn't know about while continuing to claim he had no money for basic expenses. He had been using some of the money for photography equipment and the rest for going out to bars and restaurants while letting me pay for his necessities. What made it worse was that Brock had been telling these women detailed stories about his life that were actually stories about my life. He talked about buying his first condo, his struggles with going back to school, his complicated relationship with his younger brother who was irresponsible with money. He had completely reversed our situations and was using my achievements to make himself seem like a catch. One of the women had reverse searched a photo and figured out that Brock was not the person in the pictures. She had sent angry emails threatening to report him for fraud and demanding her money back. Brock had responded by claiming it was all a misunderstanding and that his brother had stolen his identity to sabotage his life. My parents sat me down at their kitchen table and apologized for pressuring me to support Brock. My dad said he had no idea Brock was capable of this level of deception. My mom kept saying she felt like she didn't know her own son anymore. They asked what they should do about the evidence they had found. I told them Brock needed to face real consequences for this behavior, not just another family lecture about making better choices. We agreed that they would confront Brock together when he came home and demand that he contact all the women to apologize and arrange payment plans. But Brock didn't come home that night. Or the next night. My parents called his few remaining friends, but no one had seen him. His car was missing from their driveway. They tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Yesterday, my dad received a text from Brock saying he was staying with a friend in another state and needed time to think about his life. He claimed that everyone was overreacting to what he called his creative fundraising methods and that he would explain everything when people were ready to listen. My parents are devastated. They realize now that Brock has been lying to them about almost everything for years. They found more evidence in his room showing that he had been selling some of the photography equipment I had helped him buy and pocketing the money while claiming the gear was stolen. My mom asked if I thought Brock would ever come back home and try to make things right. I told her honestly that I didn't know, but that his pattern of behavior suggested he would probably resurface when he ran out of money or when his current situation stopped working for him. They both admitted that they understood now why I had cut him off and that they were sorry for making me feel guilty about it. My dad said Brock had manipulated all of us, but that I had been smart enough to recognize it first. My mom said she was proud of me for setting boundaries and that she wished she had supported my decision from the beginning. We talked about whether to report Brock's scam to the police. My parents were hesitant because they didn't want Brock to have a criminal record, but they also felt terrible about the women he had deceived. We decided to wait and see if he contacted us and was willing to make things right before taking that step. Sarah was shocked when I told her about Brock's scam. She said it explained a lot about his behavior over the years and that she was proud of me for trusting my instincts about cutting him off. She also said she was relieved that my parents now understood why I had made that decision. I feel vindicated but also sad about how everything turned out. I always knew Brock was irresponsible and selfish, but I never imagined he was capable of systematically deceiving multiple people for money. The worst part is realizing that he was using details from my life to make himself seem successful and trustworthy to his victims. My relationship with my parents has actually improved since this happened. They call me now just to check in and see how I'm doing, rather than always asking me to do something for Brock. My mom even apologized for suggesting that Sarah was a bad influence on me. I don't know what will happen next with Brock, but I'm certain now that cutting him off was the right decision. If he hadn't been forced out of his comfortable situation living off my money, my parents might never have discovered what he was really doing. Update 2. I have another update that I never expected to write. Brock came back, but not in the way anyone thought he would. 6 weeks after Brock disappeared, my parents got a call from a police detective in Arizona. Brock had been arrested for theft and fraud charges related to his fake dating profile scam, but on a much bigger scale than what we had discovered at my parents' house. Apparently, after leaving our state, Brock had moved to Phoenix and escalated his operation significantly. He had created profiles on more dating apps and was juggling relationships with over 20 women at the same time. He had also moved beyond just asking for small amounts of money and had convinced several women to send him thousands of dollars for fake business investments and made-up medical emergencies. The detective explained that one of his victims was a retired school teacher who had lost her entire savings of $15,000 to Brock's lies. She had become suspicious when Brock kept making excuses for why they couldn't meet in person and had hired a private investigator who tracked him down. When the police searched Brock's apartment, they found evidence of dozens of additional victims from multiple states, including some of the women from his earlier schemes that my parents had discovered. The total amount of money involved was over $80,000. Brock was being held without bail because he was considered a flight risk. The detective asked if my parents wanted to provide character references for the court, but they declined. My dad told the detective that they had tried to help Brock for years but that he had repeatedly chosen to deceive people instead of working to support himself. My parents drove to Arizona for Brock's arraignment hearing. They wanted to see him and understand what had happened to lead him to this point. They called me afterwards and said Brock looked terrible, he had lost weight and seemed to have aged several years in just 2 months. Brock's public defender asked my parents if they would be willing to pay for a private attorney, but they told him they didn't have the money for that kind of expense. My mom started to ask if I might be willing to help with legal costs, but my dad stopped her and said they needed to let Brock face the consequences of his choices. During their brief conversation with Brock at the courthouse, he blamed everyone except himself for his situation. He said I had forced him into desperate circumstances by cutting off his financial support. He claimed my parents had failed to teach him proper life skills. He even suggested that his victims were partially responsible because they should have been more careful about sending money to people they met online. My parents came home discouraged and exhausted. They had hoped that maybe Brock would show some remorse or acknowledgement of what he had done wrong, but instead he seemed to have convinced himself that everyone else was at fault for his problems. The case moved quickly because Brock's public defender advised him to take a plea deal rather than go to trial. With the amount of evidence against him and the number of victims involved, a trial would likely have resulted in a much longer sentence. Brock ended up pleading guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud and theft. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison with 2 years of supervised probation after his release. He was also ordered to pay restitution to his victims, though the judge acknowledged that Brock had no assets or income to make those payments. My parents told me they were relieved that Brock had been stopped before he could hurt more people, but they were also struggling with the reality that their son was in prison. My mom cried when she told me about the sentencing hearing and said she kept thinking about all the opportunities Brock had been given that he had wasted. One unexpected consequence of Brock's arrest was that some of his local victims contacted my parents after seeing news coverage of the case. 2 of the women from Brock's earlier schemes wanted to know if my parents had been aware of what Brock was doing while he was living with them. My parents explained that they had discovered evidence of the scam and confronted Brock about it, which led to him leaving their house. The women seemed satisfied with that explanation, but it was still uncomfortable for my parents to deal with the aftermath of Brock's crimes in their own community. I was contacted by one of Brock's victims who had found my information through social media connections to my parents. She wanted to know if I had any information about Brock's finances or assets that might help her recover some of the money she had lost. I explained that I had cut ties with Brock months ago and had no knowledge of his financial situation. During our conversation, this woman told me details about the lies Brock had told her about his life. He had claimed to be a successful business owner who was dealing with temporary cash flow problems. He had talked about his expensive car, his condo, and his MBA degree. He had even sent her photos of my graduation party, claiming it was a celebration for a major business contract he had won. Hearing how Brock had used details from my life and my achievements to deceive someone made me feel sick. This woman had genuinely cared about the person she thought Brock was, and he had exploited that caring for money while making her believe she was helping someone she loved. Sarah and I talked about whether I should feel guilty for cutting Brock off since it may have led to him escalating his criminal behavior. She reminded me that Brock had already been running scams while he was living with me and receiving my financial support. The only difference was that my money had allowed him to operate on a smaller scale while maintaining a comfortable lifestyle. My parents and I have had several conversations about Brock's situation since his sentencing. They blamed themselves for enabling his behavior for so many years and worried that they didn't do enough to teach him about accountability and consequences. I told them that Brock's choices were his own and that they had tried their best to support him. We decided as a family that we would not be visiting Brock in prison or putting money into his commissary account. My parents were initially conflicted about this decision, but they realized that continuing to support Brock even while he was incarcerated would just be another form of enabling his refusal to take responsibility for his actions. The whole experience has been surreal. When I cut Brock off after my graduation party, I expected him to eventually get his act together or at least find someone else to support him. I never imagined that it would lead to him becoming a federal criminal who hurt dozens of people. I keep thinking about all the women who trusted Brock and lost their savings because of his lies. Some of them were single mothers, elderly women on fixed incomes, or people who were struggling financially themselves but still tried to help someone they thought they cared about. Update 3. This will be my final update about Brock's situation. The last few months have brought some closure, but not the kind anyone in my family expected. 2 months ago, my parents received a letter from Brock in prison. They debated whether to open it, ultimately deciding they needed to know what he had to say. The letter was 4 pages long, but it wasn't the apology or acceptance of responsibility they had hoped for. Instead, Brock had written a detailed explanation of why everyone else was to blame for his situation. He claimed that I had set him up for failure by suddenly cutting off his financial support without warning. He said my parents had raised him with unrealistic expectations about life and hadn't prepared him for the real world. He blamed his victims for being naive enough to send money to someone they had never met. Brock also outlined his plans for when he was released from prison. He wanted to write a book about how the criminal justice system unfairly targets creative people who think outside traditional business models. He planned to start a consulting business helping other people avoid the legal mistakes he had made. He asked my parents to start saving money for his legal fees to appeal his conviction. My parents read me portions of the letter over the phone. My mom's voice was flat as she read Brock's justifications for his behavior. My dad said it was like Brock was living in a completely different reality where he was the victim of everyone else's failures and misunderstanding. They decided not to respond to Brock's letter. My mom said she finally understood that Brock would never acknowledge what he had done wrong, and that continuing to engage with him would just enable his delusions about being a victim rather than the person who had chosen to hurt others. Around the same time, I received an unexpected phone call from Brock's former public defender. He said Brock had been asking other inmates for help writing letters to family members and potential supporters, and that some of Brock's letters were concerning prison staff because they showed no awareness of why his behavior had been wrong. The public defender wanted to let us know that Brock was eligible for early release programs if he completed certain rehabilitation courses, but that his refusal to acknowledge his crimes meant he wasn't being accepted into those programs. He said Brock spent his time in prison reading about legal loopholes and writing complaints about his treatment rather than participating in programs designed to help inmates develop better decision-making skills. 3 weeks ago, something happened that finally gave my parents some peace about their decision to stop supporting Brock. One of Brock's victims, the retired school teacher who had lost $15,000, contacted my parents through a victim advocacy program. She wanted to thank them for not enabling Brock to continue his crimes by providing him with money for appeals or supporting him while he was incarcerated. She said she had been worried that Brock would be released early and return to scamming people, but that she felt safer knowing his family was not helping him plan his next steps. This woman also shared that she had been in contact with other victims, and they had formed a support group to help each other recover from the financial and emotional damage Brock had caused. She said many of them had felt embarrassed about being deceived, but talking with others who had similar experiences helped them realize that Brock was skilled at manipulation and that his victims were not to blame for trusting him. My parents were moved by this conversation. My mom said it helped her understand that their decision to cut ties with Brock was protecting future victims, not just protecting themselves from more disappointment and manipulation. Last month, Sarah and I got engaged. Planning our engagement party and thinking about our wedding has made me realize how different my life is now compared to when Brock was living with me and draining my finances and energy. I have been promoted at work and received the salary increase my boss mentioned at my graduation party. Sarah and I are looking at houses and talking about starting a family. We have been able to save money and make plans for our future because I'm not constantly dealing with Brock's crises or covering his expenses. My relationship with my parents has completely changed for the better. We talk regularly about normal things like work, Sarah's job, their retirement plans, and our wedding preparations. They don't ask me for money or try to guilt me into solving problems that aren't mine. My mom has started a small garden and my dad has been learning to cook new recipes, activities they say they never had time for when they were constantly worrying about Brock. My extended family members who initially criticized me for cutting Brock off have quietly stopped bringing him up in conversations. I think Brock's arrest helped them understand that my concerns about his behavior were legitimate and that continuing to support him would not have helped him become more responsible. 2 weeks ago, I was cleaning out some old files and found the folder where I had kept records of all the money I had spent supporting Brock over the years. Looking through those receipts and bank statements reminded me how much of my time and energy had been consumed by his problems and demands. I added up the total amount I had spent supporting Brock during the 3 years he lived with me. Between rent, food, utilities, insurance, transportation, equipment, and direct cash payments, the amount was just over $52,000. That money could have been a down payment on a much nicer house for Sarah and me, or the start of a college fund for our future children. But I don't regret cutting Brock off when I did. If I had continued supporting him, he would have kept taking advantage of my generosity while secretly running his scam operations. My money would have enabled him to hurt even more people while avoiding the consequences of his choices. Brock still has 2 years left on his prison sentence. My parents and I have agreed that we will not have any contact with him during that time or after his release unless he demonstrates genuine change and takes full responsibility for what he did to his victims. I know some people might think we should give Brock another chance or that families should support each other no matter what. But Brock had countless chances to make different choices. He chose to lie, steal, and hurt innocent people rather than work to support himself or accept help in learning legitimate life skills. Sarah and I are moving forward with our lives. We're planning a small wedding for next spring, buying our first house together, and building the kind of stable, honest relationship that Brock's constant drama and manipulation had made difficult to achieve. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had never cut Brock off, if I had just accepted his behavior at my graduation party and continued supporting him indefinitely. I think he would have eventually escalated his criminal behavior anyway, but he would have hurt more people and I would have been enabling him every step of the way. Cutting ties with Brock was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made, but it was also one of the best. It forced him to face consequences for his actions, protected his potential future victims, and allowed me to build a healthy life with someone who shares my values about honesty and personal responsibility. I hope Brock uses his time in prison to genuinely reflect on his choices and develop empathy for the people he hurt. But whether he changes or not, I know I made the right decision for myself, for Sarah, for my parents, and for all the people Brock might have victimized if his behavior had continued unchecked.